I welcome all the registered students in the course of Fundamentals of Computational Biology. In previous lecture, you have been gone through the topic Fundamentals of Population Dynamics. The topics that we will cover in today's lecture is Fundamentals of Graph Theory. Myself, Dr. Kush Kumar Nayak, Assistant Professor, Amity Institute of Biotechnology, Amity University, Chhattisgarh. In the present lecture, we will cover the following contents. We will see what is graph. We will also see history of graph theory, then we will jump into the basics of graph theory. We will take some examples, we will understand with the help of certain examples. Then we will see its importance, we will also see the types of graph and we will check the computational representation of graph, and finally, we also check graph representation of biological networks. Graphs are very important theme in mathematics and computer science and provide an important way to understand very complex systems such as networks that pervade biology in terms of the various entities that exist and their relationship. Graphs are essentially the mathematical formalisms that are used to study networks, but the two terms are invariably used interchangeably. Before moving into the details graph theory, let us discuss about its history. How did this concept emerge in the history of science? The history of graph theory. Graph theory has a very interesting historical origin, and like many other mathematical concepts, it is a tribute to an intellectual genius of Leonhard Euler. In 1735, Euler solved a problem now often referred as the seven bridges of Königsberg, a classical problem in recreational mathematics. The residents of the city of Königsberg, presently it is known as a Kaliningrad in Russia, had an interesting thought as to whether they could set out of from their homes, cross each of the seven bridges on the river exactly once and get back to home. This question is so banal, but seemed to be worthy of attention in the neither geometry nor algebra nor even the art of counting was sufficient to solve it. Euler of course solved this problem in a negative aspect, showing that no such walk exists. So, nobody can cross the river by crossing each once. Figure A represent in this slide, so Euler's sketch derived from the map of this city, while figure B is the first graph that was ever created. Note the mapping of nodes and edges as land masses and the corresponding bridges. The graph he made in 1735 is denoted the land masses by capital letters A to D, and 7 bridges on the river Pragal, it is represented by small letter A to G as shown in figure. However, it is not a simple graph given that it has a parallel edges running between the same pairs of vertices path. Path that begin and end at the same vertex of a graph passing through every single edge in the graph exactly once are now called Eulerian cycle in honor of his solution of Euler. Figure A, B and C present in this slide show some example of graph with and without Eulerian path. Finding Eulerian path in graph has more far reaching consequences than solving the recreational mathematics problem. Figure A and B have Eulerian path, which means you can draw them without taking your pencil off paper, passing through all edges exactly once, while in figure C this graph does not have an Euler path. Let us discuss about some basics of graph theory. Formally, a graph which can be represented by capital G is denoted as a set of V and E, where V represent the set of possible entities, namely nodes and vertices, and set of E it is relationship of the all entities. It is also known as link or edges. Every edge connects a pair of vertices from the set V, and every pair of vertices in E are adjacent to one and another. Some simple illustration graph are shown in figure the coming slides. Here in figure A, a simple graph with 8 nodes and 10 edges. Figure B represent complete graph having 5 nodes and 10 possible edges, and figure C, which is a snapshot of real protein protein interaction network having 275 nodes and 2715 edges. Every node represent a protein in the bacterium Mycoplasma genitalium from the string database version 10.5. Only functional association and interaction with the confidence of 900 and above from the single largest component of the graph are shown in the figure C. So, let us have a look on certain examples of graph. To fix ideas, let us review a few examples of graph. Every graph, as discussed above, needs to be described by a set of node or vertices and a set of edges. In social network, nodes are individual people and their friendships are edges. In city road networks, road from the edges connecting various junctions within the city. In the context of biology, we have protein interaction network, where protein are obviously the nodes and their interaction are captured by means of edges. List a few network are provided in given table, indicating what their nodes and edges typically describe. So, next question come in the mind is why such graph are important, what are the importance of these graphs. So, graphs are useful to answer many interesting questions about different type of system. For instance, social network analysis or sociometry, as it was originally called, is dated to the early 1930s. In the context of social network, many interesting questions have been asked of graph. For example, first question, do I know someone who know X, is an example of existence of path problem. Another question, how long is that chain to X, is a kind of shortest path problem. Another one is everyone in the world connected to one another, is a kind of identifying connected components kind of problem. Next question was kind of who has the most friend or who is the most influential person. It is a concern of most connected nodes centrality analysis kind of problem. Another category of problem is, we can say, can you predict if X and Y are friends? Friend suggestion can be give, it is kind of link prediction problem. Interestingly, in a very similar way, questions are often of interest in the context of biological network and can be addressed using pretty much the same graph algorithm. Question 1, with respect to biological network, is there a way to produce metabolite X from A? Second question is, how long is the optimal chain from X to A? Another category, are all protein connected to others by a path? The fourth kind of question, which is the most influential protein in the network? And fifth question is kind of, are protein X and Y likely to interact each other? So, such kind of problem can be solved with the help of graph theory. So, the graph can be classified into different types based on the nature of connections, the strength of the connections and so on. Here we will review some of these basic concepts. Total there are 12 types of graphs, namely simple versus non-simple graph, directed versus non-directed graph, weighted versus unweighted graph, sparse versus dense graph, cyclic versus acyclic graph, labeled versus unlabeled graph, isomorphic versus non-isomorphic graph, bipartite graph, implicit graph, regular graph, complete graph and finally hypergraphs. Let us discuss one by one. So, simple versus non-simple graph. A simple graph or graph without self loop or multi edges. A self loop involves an edge from a node to itself. A multi edge means that there is a more than one edge between a pair of nodes in a graph. So, self loops and multi edges necessitate spatial care while working with graph and graph algorithms. Simple graphs are devoid of such structure. Self loop do occurs in gene regulatory network, where a gene can inhibit its own synthesis. thus resulting in a vertex connected to itself. Second example of graph is directed versus undirected. Perhaps the most of important classification of graph is based on the symmetry of edges. Into directed and undirected graph, when a node A is connected by a edge to B, it means that the node B is also connected to A. In other words, A and B are adjacent to one another. On the other hand, in a directed graph, also called a digraph, there is a sense of direction to the edges as shown in figure A and B. While A may be connected by an edge to B, there may be no edge connecting B back to A. A classic example of directed network is that of CT roads network, with its one-way road, which will result in some pair of junction being connected only in one direction. In social network, Facebook friendships are undirected, whereas Twitter follow as a directed. You may follow celebrity, but they may not follow you back. In the context of biology, protein interaction network are typically undirected, while gene regulatory network are directed. A gene A may activate a gene B, but gene B may have no effect on the activation or repression of a gene A. So, next category of graph is weighted versus unweighted graph. The edge between nodes in a graph may be associated with weight, which typically represents some sort of cost as shown in figure C and D. In an airline map, for an example, the edges between airport may capture distance or flight fares. Google Map often computes two different routes, optimizing two different costs such as a time or distance. In a majority of computer science application, edge weights in a graph denote cost. In most biological application, edge weight denote the confidence in the interaction. In the case of protein interaction network or similarity, and in the case of co-expression networks. One more type of graph known as sparse versus dense graph. The sparse graph have relatively fewer edges per node on average compared to dense graph. Can prefer figures E and F. Density of graph is defined as the fraction of possible edges that actually exist in the graph. Many graphs are naturally sparse owing to the maximum number of edges that emanate from a given node. Example, rarely do we have more than 4 roads from junction in a road network. Most biological networks are also quite sparse type. Another category of graph known as cyclic versus acyclic graph. Graph can be classified as cyclic or acyclic depending on the existence of one or more cycles. A cycle in a graph is a path from a node to itself. In the graph of figure H, there is a cycle involving node A, C and B. On the other hand, there is no such cycle in figure G. Trees in computer science are example of undirected acyclic graph. Directed cyclic graph, also known as a DAGs, naturally arise in many scenarios such as in scheduling problems. Labeled versus unlabeled graph. Here, nodes in a graph may or may not have a label. In a labeled graph, every vertex is assigned a unique label distinguishing nodes from one another. Here, figure I is an unlabeled graph, while figure J represent a labeled graph. Real word graph are naturally labeled. Example, using protein names or metabolite names. In some applications, the label need not to be unique, like while representing molecule as graph with nodes being labeled by atom. Labels are typically ignored while testing for graph isomorphisms to determine if two graphs are topologically identical if we ignore node labels. Next type of graph is known as isomorphic versus non-isomorphic graph. Two graphs named G1 and G2 are said to be isomorphic if there exist are one-to-one functions that map every vertex in graph 1 and to every vertex in graph 2, such that two vertices in graph 1 are connected by an edge if and only if their corresponding vertices in graph 2 are connected by an edge. For instance, the graph in figure A and B are isomorphic. However, despite having the same number of edges and nodes, the graph in figure C are not isomorphic. Graph isomorphism have interesting implications in chemoinformatics for the study of metabolic networks. Another graph that are known as bipartite graph. A bipartite graph is a spatial type of graph where there are two disjoint independent set of nodes such that no two nodes within the same set have edges between them. Bipartite graph arise naturally in scenario where there are two types of objects like flights and airports or actor and movies, or two set of peoples like men or women. Film actor networks are bipartite where the two set of nodes represent actors and movies and the edges connected actors to the movie they started in. Bipartite graph are two colorable in that every node can be assigned a unique color such that no two adjacent node in the entire graph have the same color. It is also helpful to think of in the term of shapes, a graph of square and ellipses, where no ellipsis is adjacent to each other and no square is connected to another squares. Bipartite graphs are also very useful to represent a wide range of biological networks, capturing diverse kind of information ranging from disease, gene network or drug target network to metabolic network. Another type of graph is known as implicit graph. These are a graph that are not explicitly constructed and stored for any analysis. Owing to their prohibitive size, rather they can be studied and algorithm can be run on them. Based on definition of how nodes connected to one another, a simple example of an implicit graph would be a hypercube graph. A hypercube graph in a d dimension has 2D nodes with two nodes connected to one another. If they vary exactly in one dimensions, for d suppose equal to a value 3, we have a cube with 8 nodes and 12 edges. For very large value of d, the graph will be too large to construct and to store, yet it is possible to compute shortest path or run another algorithm efficiently on this graph, owing to the knowledge of the rules that define connectivity between the nodes. So, next graph termed as a regular graph, which means where every node has the same degree. For example, number of neighbors or the adjacent node is should be same for every vertices. In expansion of this, one graph that name it complete graph, which is all possible edges existed. All completed graph are regular actually. The last type of graph that name hypergraph. Graph typically encode only binary relationship. Often there may be n-way relationship among certain sets of entities. This can be better captured in hypergraphs, where the set of hyper edges is not just a subset of vertices, but rather than to the power v, which means power set of vertices. In another word, any subset of vertices can be designated as a hyper edge. For instance, in a protein network, protein interaction can be represented by edge. An edge between protein A and B indicates that A complexes with B. However, if a particular protein complex contains multiple subunit, as in the case of hemoglobin, representing them in a simple graph is very difficult. For example, G protein coupled receptor. G protein coupled receptor interact with heterotrimeric G proteins comprising G alpha, G beta and G gamma subunits. G beta and G gamma binds to one another, make a complex which again bind to G alpha subunit. It is not possible to accurately represent this information in a simple graph at best. We would have edges between all pair of proteins G alpha, G beta and G gamma. Metabolic or signaling network may also be represented as a hypergraph. In fact, many different type of biological network can be represented as a hypergraph. Since the better captured n-way relations vis-a-vis normal graph, which typically captured only binary interactions or relationships. Now that we have a graph, we need to represent it mathematically or computationally in terms of data structure. Here we will review some basic concept of computational representation of a graph. Data structure means a number of data structure ranging from simple to efficient are available for handling graph. A graph can be represented in term of data structure. Basically, it is comprising of two lists, age list and adjacency list. The age list is the simplest representation of a graph as a simple list of all ages. Although inefficient for computations, it happens to be the easiest way to store graph in a file and exchange them in a human readable format. In figure C, illustrate the age list of the directed graph in a figure B. Adjacency list. This list maintain a list of all nodes adjacent to a given node in a graph. More efficient representation of adjacency list can be achieved by using adjacency map. Here figure D illustrate adjacency list for the directed graph in figure B. Adjacency matrix, a very straightforward representation of graph, is the matrix representation known as adjacency matrix. A graph with node and edges can be represented by adjacency matrix containing non-zero entries. An entry aijth position in the matrix is unity if there is a age from I to j and 0 otherwise. Notably, the adjacency matrix corresponding to an undirected graph is a symmetric, as can also be observed from figure A, while that for a directed graph need not to be symmetric, figure B. So, to save space in practice, adjacency matrix of undirected graphs can be stored as upper triangular matrix. The diagonal of the adjacency matrix is typically 0 unless there are self loops, which are uncommon in most graphs. The next crucial concept is Lapsesian matrix. The Lapsesian matrix represented by capital letter L of an undirected unweighted graph is defined as L equal to D minus A, where D represent diagonal degree matrix such that D I position is the number of neighbors of I and A is the adjacent matrix if we were to ignore the weight of the graph in figure A as provided in previous slide. Its Lapsesian would be represented in the given slide. The Lapsesian has many interesting property and is very useful for graph clustering and entry field of study. Spectral graph theory is directed to the study of eigenvalues and eigenvectors of the Lapsesian matrix. हाँ बस हाँ 2-3 स्लाइड ही आ जाएगा. So, let us discuss about the graph representation of biological networks. Many biological networks are naturally represented as a graph, which also makes them amenable to several interesting analyses. Here, we will briefly overview some classic biological network and how they are typically represented. The first Example, network of protein interaction and functional association. Amongst the most widely studied biological network are protein interaction network as well as network of functional association. Their popularity is exemplified by the existence of several databases. Protein are the nodes of network with edges representing various type of association, ranging from physical interaction, complexation to co-occurrence in PubMed abstract as identified via text mining algorithms or co-expression in transcriptomes. These networks are generally undirected. Second example, signaling network. Signaling network comprises different kind of cellular components from a receptor, small molecules such as chemical messengers to intracellular signaling proteins. They can also involve the gene encoding for transcription factor, kinases, etc. Another biological network representation is protein structure network. At a very different resolution, it is also possible to represent a single protein as a network or a graph. Many interesting studies have proposed alternate useful representation of protein structure as a graph, uncovering many interesting properties. For instance, nodes can be amino acid residues in the protein structure and edges can connect node that have a pairwise interaction energy lower than a particular threshold. Fourth type, gene regulatory networks. The reconstruction of gene regulatory network is an interesting computational challenge. Gene regulatory network are typically directed, illustrating directional interaction such as inhibition, repression and activation between various genes. Gene network essentially map all interaction between gene and another genes on a directed graph. The edge weight can take both positive and negative real values depending on activation or repression respectively. Most of the genes will have a negative edge self loop in this network since the degradation rate of mRNA is proportional to its concentration. In addition to an adjacency matrix, it is also common to capture this relationship in a regulatory strength matrix. The last type of biological network is metabolic network. Metabolic network can also vary heterogeneous, involving interaction between small molecules, ions, enzymes, multi-enzymes complex and even nucleic acid. Metabolic network can be efficiently mapped onto graph in various ways, presenting interesting insights into their structure and functions. So, to study all such kind of graphs, there are several software tools are available. Many tools have emerged over the last few years to enable network analysis, particularly for biological and social network. Few are listed here. First one, Cytospace is an open source software tool for the analysis and visualization of a network. Notably, a lot of apps are available for Cytoscape which extend it for various domains ranging from social network analysis to network biology. Second example, NetworkX is an open source Python package that enables the creation and manipulation of various kind of network. It has several built-in algorithm for network analysis. Third software name, GraphViz is an open source graph visualization software which many layout algorithm. The fourth is Wide is a free desktop application for creating various kind of diagram including graphs developed by Yworks GmbH. It's notably support various automatic layout algorithms. In this slide, this is the reference where you can go through, check for more information to the relevant topic. So, I thank everyone for your kind attention. Hope this lecture have been helpful for you. We will meet you in the next lecture session very soon. Thank you.